Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Mike Norvell and Florida State. Frustrating loss Saturday night against Miami. And I think the most frustrating part about this loss for a lot of Florida State fans that follow this stuff pretty damn closely, Mike Norvell and Florida State, they dropped the ball back in 2023. Florida State had so much buzz around this program, sending guys to the NFL, winning a lot of games on the field. Meanwhile, Miami was really struggling. There was an opportunity for Mike Norvell and Florida State to really take command of the state, specifically on the recruiting trail. Mike Norvell flat out didn't. Mario Cristobal capitalized in the game that we saw late Saturday night in Tallahassee. I think was a reflection of one program doing their job on the recruiting trail, specifically along the lines of scrimmage, in one program just flat out not. And you saw that play out on the field. Why do we cover recruiting in the summer months? Why is it so important? Because of games like that, where it was very clear that Miami just had a little bit, not a little bit. And talk about the legitimate difference makers on the football field. It was heavily skewed to Miami. And look, you only find those kind of difference makers at the high school ranks. You can get lucky with the Jared Verse. You can get lucky with a Braden Fisk or a Trey Benson or a Keon Coleman. But when it comes to consistently having the best players on the football field, you get those guys at the high school ranks. And Florida State just flat out hasn't over the last couple of years. Miami has. That was the storyline of this football game. We can talk about the X's and O's all we want. Miami had better football players, specifically along the lines of scrimmage, and that's put at the feet of Mike Norvell for not capitalizing when he needed to in the state. And I think one Florida State fan in the comment section said something, at least to me, that was really intriguing. And it was that Mike Norvell, good coaching resume when he was brought to Florida State, right? But there was one maybe gap that you had, and that is he'd never been at a program where you needed to recruit at an elite level, right? He came over from Memphis. He was at Arizona State. He was at Pitt, and he was at Tulsa. Like none of those programs need to recruit at a high level to win football games. And so I don't think Mike Norvell ever had exposure to what it looks like to be a program that consistently recruits top 8 classes across the country. And so he gets to Florida State, a program that, look, if you want to win games consistently at Florida State, you need to get it done on the recruiting trail. Just don't think he totally understood how important it was to recruit at an elite level. And then you look at the other coaches that he's going up against. Kirby Smart learned from the best in Nick Saban. Mario Cristobal as well. You look at Dan Lanning up at Oregon. He learned under Kirby Smart. All these other elite head coaches in the sport as we sit here, they've learned from the best. They know how important it is to get those difference makers at the high school ranks. Mike Norvell never had that background, and he's playing catch up at Florida State. Now, I want to get into a little bit more of what we saw on the field, talk about why the importance of recruiting really played a part. And I want to talk about where does Florida State go from here as well, not only in the immediate future, but over the next couple of years as well. Before we get into it, I do want to say this to the Florida State fans. We're sitting here Monday afternoon. Would love to hear how a lot of the Florida State fans are feeling. Is Mike Norvell on the hot seat? How hot do we think that seat is? And I guess the way I'd say it is, what are the expectations for Florida State moving forward in 2025? Because I will say this, and I know the Florida State fans don't want to hear it right now. A lot of winnable games on the schedule close out 2025. Let it fly in the comment section. As always, we appreciate this fan base. Whether it's going well, whether it's not, this fan base continues to show a ton of love to the boys. So we appreciate that. Without further ado, let's get into it. Recruiting showed up. Recruiting showed up in two really obvious ways. Number one, along the lines of scrimmage. We talk about this all summer long. It's really, really hard to fill the cracks in your roster along the lines of scrimmage using the portal. You look at a guy like Ruben Bain. Those kind of players do not exist. I mean, you look at a guy like Francis Maui Noah, those kind of players do not exist. When you look at Florida State, you say the storyline is that Miami just had different level guys along the lines of scrimmage, and that is purely because Mario Cristobal has allocated a ton of effort and a ton of resources getting those guys out of the high school ranks. Now, the lines of scrimmage, that's one clear storyline. The other storyline that became very apparent was the top end talent that we saw on the football field. If we said, hey, who are the top 10 players that we saw take the field Saturday night? Florida State probably has one guy, and that's Deuce Robinson in the top 10. Like everyone else, Ruben Bain, Carson Beck, Malachi Tony, Akeem Mesidor, Markel Bell, Francis Mauigoa, all the other top end difference makers on that football field resided on the Miami sideline. Again, to me, yeah, there are a few transfer portal additions thrown in there, but a lot of those guys were homegrown talent that was recruited out of the high school ranks. Those were the two very obvious facets of the game that favored Miami. And there's really only one reason it did. It's because of what Miami's done historically over the last 3 to 4 years on the recruiting trail. Now, in terms of what happened on the football field, I think the biggest storyline here was Florida State was able to move the football. And look, I know some of it was in the fourth quarter. You could maybe say it's garbage time. They still had success moving the football. What Florida State did not do well is they didn't win the explosive play metrics. I mean, that was something we knew Florida State needed to do. Florida State did not have a play that went for over 35 yards in this football game. Miami had 3 of them, right? And so Miami was the more explosive offense that came up with more game-changing plays. I think secondly, he lost the turnover battle 3-0. That is because you have to start by just giving Miami flowers and say that is a top 3 team that we see in the sport. You could make an argument this is the number 1 team in the country, right? So when you lose the explosive play battle, of which Florida State specializes in heading into this one, then you lose the turnover battle 3-0. It's hard to beat a team that's as good as Miami. Now, I will say this, though, because I do think this is important. There are certain things that I think you feel pretty dang good about. And number one is how Florida State held up against the run. And I know Florida State was throwing some heavy box looks. I thought, regardless of that, I thought this Florida State defense held up against the run much better than I think a lot of us expected. I mean, you look at the numbers and say Miami didn't even have 100 yards. They only averaged 3 yards per carry. And outside of one 22-yard end around by Keelan Marion, there were not really any explosive plays that were generated from this Miami rushing attack. Thought the Desir brothers, I mean, they're true freshmen, but they played their tails off. Thought Daryl Jackson played pretty damn well. I thought the linebackers were fitting the run pretty damn well too. That means something because that's the biggest question mark we have for Florida State going forward in 2025. And I thought they were pretty damn good. Why Miami is so dangerous and why they won this football game is, yeah, Florida State had to allocate some bodies into the box because they knew they couldn't stop the run with the light box. Said, hey, Carson Beck, we're going to make you beat us vertically down the field. Carson Beck made some high-level throws to win this football game. And I think if you're a Florida State fan, if you're Tony White, you can live with that, right? Yeah, at least you didn't get ran on for 300 yards and Miami just kind of dominated this one wall for wall. You made Miami go out and make some plays. Miami's a really good football team. They went out and made some plays. Now, the storyline here is you don't want to have to load the box the way Florida State needed to load the box to stop Miami running. That starts with getting difference makers at the high school ranks that you can have in your front seven because there's just not a guy outside of Daryl Jackson who's going to the NFL in that front seven for Florida State. Like the Desir brothers very well will, but they're both true freshmen. They're still they play really damn hard and they're going to be really good football players for Florida State, but you don't want to rely on 2 true freshman defensive linemen going up against an offensive line that's got 5 guys that are probably going to be selected in the NFL draft, at the very least 4, right? The other thing is this team didn't quit. And let's just be straight up about it. Like we saw last year that coaching staff quit and that locker room quit. This team didn't. They had a very tough loss on the road against Virginia. They come back home for a rivalry game against Miami to go down. At one point, it was 28-3, I believe, Florida State battles back and plays a really good fourth quarter where they were getting off the field on defense, where they were marching on offense, coming up with some fourth down conversions. That to me, that matters, because one of the biggest storylines in terms of where we go from here is, hey, can Florida State get off the mat? This was a team that was ranked in the top 10 2 weeks ago, is now the 25th team in the country, back-to-back losses. Do we trust this locker room? Do we trust this program to get off the mat and fight? I think you do, because of what you saw in the second half against Miami. And then I'm looking at that schedule and say this, hey, I have Florida State favored just about every single game. On the road at Clemson is going to be a tricky one. On the road at Florida is going to be a tricky one, given the way we saw Florida play Saturday. You're going to have some opportunities to collect some quality wins. But here's the bottom line. Florida State's going to have the ability and the opportunity to win every single game on their schedule. And I'll say this, 10-2 Florida State, you're going to have at least be in the conversation to make the college football playoffs, depending on how what Clemson becomes and what Florida becomes. Regardless of that, here's the thing. I think we all know this team's not a national championship team. It'd be fun to make a run at the college football playoffs, but we know this team's probably not getting over the hump and winning a national championship this year. How does it get fixed long term? You have to capitalize. And here's the one piece of optimism here. And I know there's a lot of Florida State fans that just want to be done with Mike Norvell, and I don't blame you for thinking that. The new staff that Florida State brought in, Gus Malzahn, Tony White, all these assistant coaches, they're doing a really good job on the recruiting trail. I mean, heck, they left the summer with a top 15 class in the country coming off a 2-10 season. What happens if you finish 10-2 at the worst, maybe 9-3, 8-4, whatever it is? What happens when you show, hey, Florida State's kind of going back in the right direction? Can you close on a top 10 class in the country? Florida State's going to have the opportunity to do that. That's where it starts. I use this analogy a lot. It is kind of like running a marathon if you hadn't worked out in 3 years. Florida State has not done the right things in terms of building this roster over the last 3 years. They've been way too heavy in the portal, just not collecting enough blue chip talent, specifically along the lines of scrimmage at the high school ranks. You can't just snap your fingers and want to go compete with the best of the best in the sport that have been operating at a high level the last 3 years. Florida State needs to eat their vegetables, start doing things the right way, building this thing back up the right way. Is Mike Norvell the guy to do that? I think more importantly, is the new coaching staff the right group of coaches to do that? We'll see, right? We'll see how Florida State finishes off in 2026. We'll see what it looks like in 2027. To me, the biggest story is, are we going to start building this roster the right way? That's to be determined. But that's where it starts, right? If you want to get back banging with a team like Miami and competing for championships, you have to start doing things right in the winter. You got to start doing things right in the spring, and you have to start doing things right in the summer. Then you've earned the right to start competing at the highest level on the football field in the fall. But you got to take care of some of that stuff from a roster building standpoint. We'll close it out there. To the Florida State fans, hey, let it fly in the comment section. Appreciate you guys. Sound off if you want, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.